Really nice to have you here. Thank you for making time today.
Well, thanks for having me. I think it's a lot of fun to have these kinds of conversations. Take me
I
out
agree.
of my realm and into some really interesting new ways of thinking about what I do.
When it's people like you that most of us, to be frank, who are running companies or are founders anywhere in the United States or policymakers, we don't get access to. It's not a lot. Uh, it's not common to bump into a scientist who's been working on research in a lab for how many years now?
Well, I tell people I went to college when I was 18. That was 50 years ago, and I never left.
Okay,
So effectively, I mean, I started doing it professionally 40 years ago.
it's a
So
few years.
I've been at it for a while. Yes.
Yeah, it's a few years. That's funny. Um, I you and I were chatting a little bit before, and I just want to dive straight in. We're going to talk about brains. Your core area is researching brains, brain health, behavioral patterns. You have a specific little prototype that you like to study to learn a lot from their brains, which is bees. And
And
we'll
fruit
talk about
flies. And fruit flies.
fruit flies. I forgot about that.
Tiny brains relative to ours.
Yeah, and you've seen haven't you seen like a fruit fly brain all chopped up into tiny slides?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that was. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a few weeks at my talk at the Innovation Collective. That was literally a moonshot,
Tell me.
and I'll explain why it was a moonshot to get the first entire connectome, all the neurons, and understand how all of them are interconnected. That took, from a tiny fruit fly brain, millions of sections, tedious reconstruction with electron microscopy. And it was just in the last few years, since 2018, there's been a few publications out with some absolutely stunningly beautiful pictures of a tiny little brain. And one of the things I'd like to explain is how hard is that? Well, you think there are 130,000 tiny neurons in that brain. That's a lot for a tiny brain, you would think.
Yeah.
And so, what's that? 10 to the fifth, let's say, neurons. And each
Okay.
neuron makes 10 to the fifth connections. That's 10 to the 10th. That's about 10 million connections that had to be precisely and exquisitely mapped
I'm gonna
just to
try and
find out.
I'm gonna try and
Pardon?
throw up like a picture of a fruit fly brain. Let me see here. Can you see this?
Yeah,
Is this what you're talking about?
yeah, that stuff right there.
Okay. So you got to see a tiny little brain there, but chopped up into glass slides so that you could see all the connectivity of how many slides, how many pieces of glass?
Oh, millions.
Wow.
Tiny, thin sections from different angles.
Look
And
at
it took
that.
several different studies, and that's one. That's the larval brain. That's even smaller. That's only 10,000 neurons.
Are you it's funny you knew that right there. Are you one of the people who worked on this?
I am not, um, but I actually, this was done. The first group that did this was at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, Janelia Research Campus outside of Washington, D.C. And I was there while they were doing it. I went to several meetings, so I know the people. And I kept saying things like, "Gee, when are you guys going to do a hard brain like a bee brain?" And they just rolled their eyes because a bee brain is about 10 times bigger than a fruit fly brain, and is that much more complex.
Which
But
is your wheelhouse is bee brains.
yeah, that's more my wheelhouse, is what I study for
I saw a picture of you on the internet, literally covered by like a whole like helmet of bees. It was
yeah,
quite a lovely photo. So
that's a trick you can do with bees. When you take the queen away from bees, her pheromone level on the colony goes down, and the workers panic because without a queen, they're dead. So they're really attracted to a queen pheromone. So you dump the workers out on the ground. They're confused, and you put a queen here right underneath your chin, and they all latch on. And they don't. I didn't get stung when I did that, but I had about 8,000 bees all over my head.
it's ridiculous. Let me see if I can find a picture of this actually.
Oh, you
Uh,
did find a picture of that?
yeah, yeah. No, here, look at.
I'm no longer amazed at what you can find on the internet these days.
Oh my gosh, right? It's everywhere. Yeah, here it is. Here, hold on. It's so great. I was amazed that I mean it was a little stunning to be honest.
Oh, there it is.
Look at there you are with like your bees, which is crazy. And there's like a better picture of you now as like researcher Brian. Um,
Well, I used to show that picture at the end of my professional talks.
yeah,
I stopped doing it because the first question I always got was not about my research. It was, how did you do that with the bees? Um,
can
but
imagine.
it's fun.
Well, let's. I want to do something because it feels very appropriate. And you and I were chatting about this. We'll dive into our brains, how to manage our brains, behavioral science, things you've discovered from how bees operate, how we operate, how we can learn to be maybe better at our brain health as leaders, as humans. What's going on with our brains? We're going to cover all sorts of space, but I want to start at this point. You operate in a space funded by taxpayer dollars. And right now, there's this giant chaos going on in what are we using our taxpayer dollars for? And
And I don't. I'll add here. I don't think it's bad chaos necessarily. It's
me too.
good to to bring this question out and explode some myths, and justify others. So I think it's actually. I'm not going to say this is horrible going on.
Yeah,
I actually think it's a good, exciting thing because exciting opportunities come out of these kinds of discussions.
I agree. And if anything, we're going to be confident in where we put our money and understand why. And the American public might actually get excited about the uses of funds to research certain things, to go make a difference somewhere, to build some type of infrastructure versus things we're discovering where sometimes science labs are scrapping to get money or our healthcare system is. And we're finding all these uses of funds that are like pretty questionable. It doesn't matter if you're left or right or up or down. Like it's shocking. You had a statement you made where you teach your students. I think you called it the Starbucks coffee line. What
Yeah,
is that?
yeah.
Yeah.
So, um, my lab lives and dies based on federal funding, Defense Department also, and all of the PhD students have to go through what is called a qualifying exam 2 to 3 years into their 6 year PhD study. Qualifying exam is where they're up in front of five of us, and we get to ask them questions about their research, but also general questions in science. And one of the questions I always ask is, you're standing in a Starbucks coffee line. It can be Pete's if you like Pete's, it doesn't really matter. Um, and you strike up a conversation with a taxpayer standing next to you, and they find out what you do, and they say, why do you do that?
Yeah.
So my Starbucks coffee line conversation is, you have the time it takes to make a latte to tell them why your work is important and why they should be funding it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. And for a lot of times, I think people felt like, other people were making these decisions. And now public sentiment is feeling more like it's this belief that we should be collaboratively having some insight and collectively voting, especially in a world where we have cell phones. I've been thinking about this a lot. We built our model of making decisions when most people couldn't read, when to get a decision sent to everybody in the United States would have taken, millions of horses and days. Then find someone who could read it to the whole town, get everyone's like decision, and then ride the horses back somewhere to like make a decision and decide how we distribute the money. So we built this whole model where for the most part, it's like we're gonna decide every so often who the smartest people, the brightest, best deciding people, the public leaders, and we will send them off to this magical land to go decide
Called
on,
Washington, D.C.
yeah, or like the state capitol, where we're going to decide how the money actually gets used and what's important to all of you. And like, look, that was a pretty cutting edge system to represent the people when we didn't have a day where I send emails before I'm done with them now and they arrive across the world. And I wrote like, you know, hey Brian, what's up? I wanted to really, and then somehow hit send. I'm like, oh man, and I can like call it back. It's like we send messages now faster than ever. So we should be at least thinking about what does a new model of decision making look like around budgeting for these things. But we do need the expertise of of people. And what I guess what's your coffee line, man? If I caught you at Starbucks and was like, Brian, you've screwed around in a lab playing with bugs. You've spent $20 million of taxpayers' dollars. What the hell's wrong with you? And like, what would you say back? You're like, this is why it matters.
I would say look at a human brain. It's huge. It's tremendously complex. We can't even begin to do with even a tiny little fraction of the human brain what we just did with a fruit fly brain.
Yeah.
And this is the analogy I'm going to draw in a few weeks. Imagine if I came into you, and neuroscientists, we have a reverse engineering problem. You know, if you're a computer scientist, you can build a computer from the ground up, and it has to operate a rover on Mars for a year. It has to make sure your toast doesn't burn. It has to help you write a manual. You know what it has to do, so you can build it from the ground up to do that task. We're handed a computer, the human brain, and we have to reverse engineer it. We have to take it apart, and we can't do that with a human brain for obvious reasons. But we could say, let's say I give you a supercomputer, you'd start taking it apart, you'd break it really fast, and you come back and say, Brian, I need another $7 million supercomputer, and I'd start saying, well, how many of these do you really need? And then you say, well, you know, there's a much more cost-effective way of doing this. Is I can buy a little hand calculator for $5, and it can add 2 + 3 and get 5. The big computer can do that too. Maybe I can use that little hand calculator to get an idea of how these kinds of computations can be done. And for a scientist, that's important, because imagine you're feeling your way around in a dark room.
Yeah.
Suddenly, I have something specific to look for. That's like having a flashlight in that dark room, and that's called a hypothesis,
What are
right?
things that what are hypotheses, or what are outcomes that your research has been applied to that you can talk about publicly? Because I know you've done research in fruit fly brains that have been applied to Department of Defense things that you might, I don't know if you can or can't talk about
Oh
those,
yeah,
but
I,
like,
I can tell. I don't do classified stuff.
yeah, then tell me, like, because right now it's like, cool, your justification for running a $20 million lab, which is like, you've been awarded 20 million plus over the years. You weren't given 20 million for Brian to like buy a mansion and fill it with bees. It was like to buy equipment, hire students, do research, deliver reports. So he's not driving a bee colored Bugatti. But
I wouldn't have a bee colored anything actually like a Bugatti.
good. But like, what has it turned into that matters to me? Like, does that make sense? Like, what has your research done that helped my life?
Well, one of the things I'm very interested in is plasticity in the brain. So we learn something, our brain changes.
Yeah.
All of those synapses that I mentioned, what did I say? 10 million in a fruit fly. You train a fruit fly, and fruit flies can learn. You train a fruit fly, and the pattern of synaptic connectivity changes, because the fruit fly now has to do something in order to get food or avoid shock or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So, how do those synapses change? And something very specific, if you want to get specifically to my research, that we funded is some bees. I noticed many years ago when I first started training bees. And if you're an entomologist, bees are the paragons of learning in the insect world. They're like the Einsteins, right? And I would bring bees into the lab and I would start training them. And some bees learn really well, and some bees learn poorly. And remember, bees are social,
Yeah.
right? So they have this big colony with 100,000 bees in it. Um, and I wonder, well, why are these bees not learning? I mean, I didn't think they were stupid. Um, and at first I thought, well, maybe they're getting Alzheimer's disease, and some students ruled that out right away. And then I thought, well, maybe it has to do with motivational states, and some other students ruled that out. Um, you're getting the impression that Brian is often wrong, and he is. Um,
Which is
and
good.
this is me feeling my way around in this dark room. And it turns out there's a genetic predisposition that the bees that weren't learning well because I was asking them a specific question that they weren't disposed to do very well on.
Hmm.
Change the question and they do a lot better. Now, one of the things we found is in the circuitry in the brain, we've identified specific circuitry,
Okay.
synaptic connections that change when we train the bees to. It's a protocol where we train the bees to ignore something. that sounds kind of weird. We're supposed to be trained to pay attention, but if you weren't ignoring the millions of things around you right now, you wouldn't be able to listen to what I'm saying. So learning to ignore things is really important.
Yeah.
And one of the things we found is that the way these bees differ genetically, it's a single gene that we've mapped, and we looked at how it functions in the brain, and it acts like a gain control. So you can turn up or turn down a synapse by activating or inhibiting this gene.
That
So it's like
specific gene would be.
that specific gene in bees, but there are this gene and another one are the what people call analogs of the adrenergic system, the epinephrine norepinephrine system in our brains.
So would it be fair to say your students and you've kind of found like a flow state gene that can allow you to ignore everything else and just dial in on one thing?
It's kind of like a flow state. Yeah, you would say that.
Okay, that's awesome. That's like
And but what I want
this
to
is
do
the Nick
now,
translation. So we're talking at Starbucks. I'm like, wait a second, this is a flow state gene. Like, keep
yeah.
going.
So what I want to do now is I've been talking to my colleagues who work on mammals, and I said, hey, what about this adrenergic system? You know, could we try to? I think I found something important that has a parallel in humans, and I'd love to go test this now in mammals, and a colleague who I'm working with right now to actually measure these two different substances in the bee brain using a very sophisticated technique. We're talking about AI using machine learning to actually track some of these substances in the brain in real time. He actually works on humans. He developed these electrodes to put into human brains into channels that surgeons put into human brains for deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's, epilepsy treatments. And he can
Okay.
actually go and put these electrodes in the brain, tune them for norepinephrine and epinephrine, and get them to do what bees are doing. And I want to see if what we found in bees holds in humans.
Wait, when you say
Maybe
two,
it doesn't, but to me, this
yeah,
is exciting.
yeah, no, it is. It is. So this is kind of like Neuralink, brain
Yeah.
stimulation. And so when you say tune them, do you mean like changing the electric signature so that it creates a reaction or an output or a
Well, no, you can
stimulation?
get humans to play games and
Okay,
attention
smart.
games right on a computer. So they're recording from the brain, and you can get them to play certain kinds of games that require different types of attention or different levels of attention. And I would love to see if there's something very similar going on in mammals, mice, and humans that we just found in bee brains. And the important thing is a lot of people think here's a neurotransmitter, and a lot of people know about dopamine. A lot of people know about serotonin, what it does. Dopamine is our reward signal. You eat a candy bar, dopamine elevates in your brain and it says something good. Serotonin is aggression, also depression. Prozac elevates serotonin in our brains. Um, and people think, okay, dopamine does this. And I was giving a talk in Germany recently, and I said, I don't think it's dopamine or serotonin or any of the biogenic amines. I think it's really a ratio between them. And somebody in the audience said, yes, 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 absolutely. Right. So that's what I'm saying is this is a conversation I'm having, and I'm excited that I can have this conversation with people who work on humans even,
Yeah.
because
And
I
do
think
you,
it's important.
well, do you consider, yeah, because your research is directly correlating to chemistry of the brain, our behavior, depression,
Right.
happiness, motivation, ability to like have tunnel vision, flow state, um, and what,
Can I make one more? Can I make
yeah,
one more quick point
please.
about that? Bees in certain flow states or not. Um, as I said earlier, the colony is social, and it turns out that the colony has different proportions of bees in these different states.
Okay.
And one of the things we're testing right now, and we've tested this using computational models, and it holds up, but that doesn't mean the biology is going to hold up. Is that a colony needs a different distribution of these animals in different states because one animal is really good at finding new things and another animal is really good at exploiting the things that were just found, right? So it's an exploration trade-off. You need the explorers and you need the exploiters, and that's exactly what we're studying. And we make models of social networks that have animals that have different kinds of predispositions. And the agents in these social networks, they could be ants, fruit flies, bees, mice, or humans.
When you
So
say,
we even have applicability, I think, to human social networks and how
yeah,
social networks function.
yeah, and that ties to the brain level and the social level of the hive, and you're studying both. Question.
I think of a bee colony as a big brain.
Yeah, yeah, a big brain and a big city, right? Like a
Yeah,
community. With
yeah,
people
exactly.
congregating. Yeah. So, are you inferring there's an explorer and exploiter gene, or an explorer and an exploiter personality potentially? Which one?
Yes.
Interesting.
Well, I think it's a personality type, and people these days, a big area of research is in animal personalities, all different kinds of animals where individuals differ and they seem to have different personalities to
Jobs.
do things.
When you say
And
personality,
what
in
I'm
other
saying
words,
is there is a genetic basis to that.
yeah, when you say personality, it could be interoperable to call it a job, right? Like, because the
Yeah.
personality of the animal is like the role it plays within the little tribe, the colony, the whatever it is. So, leaning into that a little bit,
But bees naturally gravitate toward the jobs that they're good at.
all right,
I
that's
think a
fair.
lot of humans get trapped into doing jobs that they are not good at. So they need to find the right job because things that you're good at might be different from the things that I'm good at.
How do how do bees sort that? Like, how do their brains function that way? Because there's like I love the concept of the big difference between that I think of how I phrase it is a major difference between animals and humans is our ability to tell ourselves stories.
Hmm.
We can tell stories, and these stories become shared myth, which drives culture. And that story is also the story we tell ourselves, and it becomes part of our identity. And it's kind of a trip to realize most of our decisions are made through sense making, pattern matching, and then some narrative that makes it feel like this is the right thing because we say it to be so.
Hmm.
And then there's this other level, which is pure primal laws of nature truth that we operate in. And it's this balance between narrative and primal. And when you're
Bees are a
talking,
lot closer to your primal side.
that's just going to say, and so
Yeah.
when you're talking about the primal, how do they sort each other for tasks and jobs? Because, like, in my mind, I'm envisioning this like factory where it's like, how far do we go? Because I have a theory that post World War II, we got so afraid of telling people what they were good at. We just told everybody, like, you can do anything, kids. And it was this paralyzing reality of like a huge world, industries exploding. And so everyone wanted to just be, at the time, a rock star or a professional athlete. And then it became like entrepreneur or rapper. And now it's, I want to be an influencer. And the only reason why they pick those is because it's the most honored role in society that is in front of them every single day. And so they pick the thing that they think would give them the most social and economic
Yeah.
credit. They don't pick based on skills.
And then suddenly you realize if everybody in society was a social influencer, they wouldn't have anybody to influence.
Man, they don't make money, most of them. And like
I know.
over 50% of Gen Z, I think, that's their like key aspiration is like, I want to be an influencer. And it's like, how do we sort the humans like we sort the bees is my question. And is it going to be ethical? What you're about to tell me. So bring that
Oh,
up.
I'm not sure how to. I mean,
How do the bees do it? Let's start there.
first, how do the bees do it?
Hmm?
A bee colony has about 50,000 bees in it, a moderate sized, those white boxes that you see along the road. And a bee lives about 6 to 7 weeks. So when that bee emerges as an adult on day one, it's going to have about a 6 or 7 week lifespan, and then it's going to die. Basically, it gets worked to death. It gets worn out. So that bee, as a young bee, they go through a progression of jobs in the colony. Under normal circumstances, the first thing that bee is going to do is it starts taking care of the developing young bees, feeding them, cleaning them, and maybe they help take care of the queen, feeding the queen, pushing the queen over somewhere to lay eggs. And then they start secreting wax scales on their body, and that's where all the wax in a bee colony comes from. You pick up some bees, and they have these little flaky scales on the bottom of them. And yeah, you can pick them up without getting stung. By the way, I'll teach you how to do that if you like, Nick. Um, they have wax scales, and they chew off the scales, and they chew it and build it into the colony, and that's where all the wax. So they build out the colony. Then, as they get older, they start shifting down to the entrance of the colony, and they defend the colony. They become guard bees. Those are the bees that are first to sting if you go up and kick the side of the colony. Then, for the last 2.5 weeks, the bees turn into foragers. That's the most dangerous job. That's when they start expending a lot of energy. That's when they undergo a lot of oxidative damage because their metabolic rates are so high, and they fly out over a radius of about 3 miles from their colony, which, when you think of how big a bee is, that's a long way to fly, right?
What would be the comparison? Like if we went 3 miles, we're talking like that's hundreds of miles or thousands.
I drive regularly between Arizona and Idaho.
Yeah, no, I mean like my physical size and my stride versus like a bee's. Granted, they fly.
I mean,
But
you're
like,
talking probably 30, 40 miles.
yeah, it's huh. So they go forage that far. What do they do
Yeah,
after? Do they do that till they die?
so the point I was making is they go through a progression of tasks as they age. But
Yeah,
the
is that the final
colony,
task though too? Like is
the foraging is usually the final task because they die foraging.
Huh.
But the colony is very flexible. So if I go into the colony, and a colleague of mine, Gene Robinson at University of Illinois, who's famous for doing this, at least in my world, and was famous in a lot of worlds. But he would go in and he'll say, you can take all the nurse bees away from the colony, the bees that are taking care of the brood. So suddenly they have a lot of guards and foragers and constructing bees, but they don't, the brood's going to die. So those older bees can shift, and they detect the absence of nurses, and they can shift back and become nurses. So the colony is very, very flexible.
Huh. So it's like, wait a second, you're right. You're like Philip Zimbardo of bees. Like you're just like running the Stanford Prison experiment with bees and like yanking all the nurses away and seeing what happens.
That's what you can do. You can do these kinds of experiments. And I wrote a paper recently with a PhD student where we argued if the colony is a big brain, I can do brain-like experiments on the colony by creating a lesion when I go in and I remove all these bees. And I can see how does the brain, like if you a human brain, it's hard for our brains many times to recover from damage, right? Which is a lesion. But a lot of people who have brain damage, like in a car accident, after months and months and months of therapy, they can do something again, walk again.
Put it back together. Yeah. So
Yeah, but that's the brain being plastic. That's the brain doing exactly what the bee colony just did.
So when you compare, you keep saying like a bee colony is like a brain, but then you're studying the bee brain. When you translate this to brain health or brain patterns or social patterns, how has this informed your thinking about your own choices or like how you choose to live? And have you made changes because of what you've observed in the bees? And or have you applied the technology that you're learning to anything that's been commercialized, like on the industry side?
First, to the commercial side, I am extraordinarily interested in doing that. In other words, if you said I could spend the next 5 years writing 10 more papers about things I've already written about for the last 20, it's just boring to me. I'd rather somebody else do that. But if I have the chance to make something from what I've done that would be a commercial product, I'll leap at it. That would be the capstone. And I actually am working with a colleague at UC San Diego. He's a mathematician. He does AI models, builds machine learning algorithms. And we wrote a proposal to an NSF engineering program. National Science Foundation, they fund engineering research. And the problem they posed was that current state at least 2 years ago. And of course, we're in a different universe with AI every 10 seconds these days. But there are certain things that AI models cannot do very well. One of them is generalize their learning principles, right? Now, certain AI models can probably do that right now, but human brains are really better at that. Another thing is how do you learn new things without destroying your old knowledge? If you're storing things in a memory and you learn something new, how do you avoid that overwriting all those synaptic changes that just occurred for you to have some other knowledge, right? And we argued that one of the things brains do when we sleep is absolutely critical, not just to make us not tired, but for our brains to rejuvenate.
Okay.
Our brains are changing a lot while we're sleeping. And one of the things that we argued was that the thing that we haven't built into AI programs is a sleep-like state, where the program can actually stop and think a little bit about what it knows, what does it critically need to know that, get rid of all the other chaff, and then move on to learn something new without destroying the old. And bees sleep. We study bee sleep right now.
Do they dream?
Pardon?
Do bees dream?
Well, TBD.
Oh, you're in the middle of it right
They
now.
have brain activity. Yeah, we're in the middle of this. We put electrodes in bee brains and we watch them sleep, and we can record electrical activity over 24 hours with the idea that.
Wires in them right now?
Pardon?
Do you have any bees with wires in them right now in the lab?
We will in about 20 minutes. I have a student doing that, and I can walk my computer over and show everybody an actual recording.
Okay, it's kind of awesome.
But so you say apply something.
Yeah.
My colleague
AI models and other things that make sense with it, of algorithms that you guys are learning about from the bees.
Right. So he develops the algorithms, and we provide the hypotheses about what could be changed to help AI algorithms improve their ability to learn new things without destroying old, to generalize the knowledge. When I say generalize, I mean, imagine you park your car in a parking lot somewhere, right? And there's a bunch of cars parked around it. And if I sit here and say, close your eyes and imagine what your car looks like.
Yeah.
And you would say, okay, I'm looking at the left side, the back, the right side, the front, and I know what my car looks like. But now imagine I put you in a balloon and I hover above the parking lot, and you have to recognize your car from an angle you've never seen it, right? You'd be able to do it because you can take these mental images and rotate them. That's what I mean by generalization. And that's a really dynamic and flexible and powerful kind of memory that the human brain represents that maybe AI is evolving toward right now. But there are lots of things that human brains can do that AI still can't do.
Yeah, and
that's my product. That's my product.
Which I
now,
like
my own, I will say my own. You asked me also, what have I learned in my own principles? I think I'm a little ADD. I'm always thinking, oh, what's that shiny new thing over there? And coming up with some crazy ideas at times. And one of the problems I have is I'll say, okay, I'm going to do this X today. And then I get involved in, hey, wait, maybe I can do Y. And wait, there's Z too. And I set myself, based on my studies of attention, a New Year's resolution, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. And I've stuck with it, and it really works. And the resolution is stick with the plan. Because the plan you actually planned was probably the best one because you thought through it. And the impulsive thing that you want to switch to is probably not going to work as well because you haven't thought through it as well. And stick with the plan works incredibly well for me. So if I had to say, what have I learned for myself? It's, stick with the plan. The original plan is probably going to be the best one.
It's interesting you say that, because one of the things I found in my life is that ruthless routines that are in service of a very clear and explicit goal. So if I create patterns and systems that are consistent daily, weekly, even down to like the hour, that as soon as you wake up, if I follow these patterns or ruthless routines, I get the output I want. It's when I start to give myself the freedom to be more creative and feel the moment. I like to be present in the moment and feel it once in a while. However, programming in time to wander is lovely. I've
Oh
actually,
yeah.
for a long time, on my schedule had time specifically in the week to like wander. I scheduled meeting strangers for a while. And if I had those patterns that drove my primal kind of want, I would get to it and I would do it. If I didn't do that, I didn't have I didn't have that. It wouldn't happen sometimes. Like I would just get too caught up in other things.
Well,
So
I was gonna say my Starbucks coffee line conversation.
yeah,
I really like them. I mean, if I didn't know you and you're standing next to me in a Starbucks coffee line, I'll probably strike up a conversation with you.
it's
And
good.
they're fun. They can be really fun.
Well, and it's coming back to like the spend of money. Sometimes it's hard to justify some of the research going on in labs, and it's got to translate into value for the human race in some arc of history in a timeline. And
I agree.
it's hard to take the moment and value it fully, especially when you realize some of the greatest breakthroughs are built upon this pyramid of knowledge that was built over decades and decades and decades and decades and decades and then pop. And that's the beauty of this whole model where we're supposed to have tenure and researchers and PhD students that are in the labs doing really hard work. I think we've diluted that a bit in some university models where they're getting all this additional funding to build more buildings, do more things, and we've over bubble wrapped the universities and the national laboratories and a lot of these locations where back in the day, if it's warfighter time, we do crazy stuff and we make breakthroughs fast. Like if
Yeah.
we're going to do things to defend our nation, we do great things. When it's peacetime, you need like 10 people to move a water bottle. And so it's like, how do we bring some cowboy energy and
So
commercialization into the national labs, into the research centers, to where students are and citizens are banging on the doors to come hang out in your lab and collaborate with you versus being pushed away and being told like, oh, you need to take like 50 years of school and then someday you could even step foot in here. Because it feels like most universities are over there. And like, I care about my brain, but I also don't want to be in your way. But like, I'd love to build products with you that make brains better.
I love to get high school students in the lab, and one of my colleagues in the lab, Hong Lei, is really good at it. And we get sophomores in high schools from the Phoenix area working in our lab. We had one that just stuck with us for 7 years, and she's on published papers with us. And they're
High
young
school
and
has
they're
published
curious.
papers.
Yeah. Oh yeah. 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 If you do enough work in my lab, you're going to get on a published paper, and that's the gold standard in my
Yeah.
field, right?
You
But
want to be a
one of the,
scientist, you're a high schooler with a published paper by the time you apply to go to college or like join a startup.
yeah,
How
it's
do they
it's
get in there? How do they, like if I'm a high school student and I'm curious about brains, because let's be
you
honest,
write me an email.
yeah, but like not just you. Like let's pretend it's a university in your own backyard. Someone who's listening to this somewhere. What's the best way? Is it write an email to a professor and say, "Hey, I'd really love to say what? Like I'd love to shadow you for a day. I'm very curious in the industry."
Can I come in and talk to you about your research? I read about your research, or I'm really interested in a research career and thinking about this. Tell me a little bit about yourself. And that's the first thing that I'm going to ask somebody when they come to meet with me. But first, somebody writes me an email, it already shows some initiative.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
one big thing, and I've said this for 30 some odd years, and I was at Ohio State University, huge place, before I was at Arizona State University, which is an even bigger place. Don't tell Ohio
Michael
State I
Rowe is
said
only
that.
making it bigger and bigger and more
Yeah,
powerful.
yeah.
He's done
And
incredible job of research and commercialization, by the way.
yeah, the one thing that uh, a big mistake that so many students make is they don't talk to me.
Are
I'm
they
lecturing.
afraid of you or what? Or are they just too busy?
I don't know. And I tell people I really actually like it when they come and talk to me. It's fun. And I always make a joke that if I want to have some time to write, I'll schedule office hours because I'll be alone. And if anybody's listening to this
Sucks.
podcast and you have college students, tell them to just talk to their professor. Sometimes they get rebuffed. Well, fine, go to talk to the next guy, because sooner or later somebody's going to sit you down and they're curious about you. And the first thing I want to know with students is, what turns you on? What are you really curious about? I'm not going to give you a research project. I want you to tell me what you want to do, and I'll find something that matches what your interests are.
I
Right?
think there's a brokenness to higher ed right now that curiosity or a sense of adventure is being fulfilled by video games, Netflix, and YouTube, when it should be in person building and creating, not consuming content,
Yeah.
but it should be creating what goes out in the world. And a lot of times I do think there's a transactional nature to university where it's like, I just have to get through this thing. Or
I
people
just got
have,
to check the boxes.
yeah, and
Believe
like
me,
people have,
I can give a whole lecture about that.
parents have been sending kids to university just to get the checkbox. Like, I did it. And these kids don't want to be there. I feel the same way about high schoolers. To be really blunt, let's like a total education tangent. I don't think that high schoolers who are like being obnoxious and pissy and do not want to be there or put in the work or try should be forced to go to high school. I think we should be like, cool, go get a job.
Uh,
And
um, Maybe Michael Crow might not like me saying this, but I think not everybody needs to go to college.
I fully agree. He probably
Um,
would. He probably would fully agree as well. To be frank,
he might. I mean, look at Bill Gates, Steve Jobs. He didn't finish college. Steve Jobs took a course in calligraphy. And you
but
think, how can
having a
calligraphy?
relationship with a college is fundamentally important to be able to shape your life because it's access to
To have
wisdom.
something like calligraphy available, and you'd say, why would you study calligraphy? Well, that's where proportional fonts came from that made Apple famous.
Yeah, and the artistic belief that this can be more than just a numbers cruncher. It
Right.
actually could be this dance between man and machine that's more artful, which came out of research and all sorts of labs. I mean,
So
you wouldn't have what we have today on our devices we're talking to each other through if we didn't have national labs and if we didn't have scientists and researchers at universities being funded through the National Science Foundation, the NSF, which funded a lot of these fundamental breakthroughs. I mean, unless we had a bunch of aliens drop all this technology and we just like hijacked it out of a broken craft and we were like, look, we made the things. It was years of research. So it's either we hijacked
so
it.
I hope aliens give us technology, because we'll just take that technology and innovate on top of it and make something really cooler, right?
Exactly.
I don't care if
Exactly.
aliens gave it to us. We'll just make it cooler.
It's funny. On the aliens piece, jumping ahead,
Well,
people
actually,
talk about,
can I make a quick point about something you said earlier?
please, please.
That and you're talking about, we're a little bit staid in our positions at big universities, and there's this thing called tenure, right?
Yeah.
And you hear about that a lot. I have tenure. It's not true that I can't be fired, but it makes it more difficult.
Damn hard though. Yeah.
And Michael Crow, who you mentioned, who's our president, is a guy who I admire a lot, because he took a huge behemoth of a university, which is like an oil-laden super tanker, and he's changed it fundamentally. Right?
Culturally,
That's
it's a
not
whole
easy
different
to
place.
do. But I was on the University Promotion and Tenure Committee, which is the last decision before it goes to him. Uh, and he would always meet with us at the before we got started to look through 80 or 100 P&T files that semester, and he would say he saw careers in terms of trajectories. You get an assistant professorship, untenured, tenure track position at a university, and you've been on this trajectory with your PhD and postdoctoral research, and suddenly you have resources. You
Yeah.
get money to set up your lab. You get a nice salary. You get access to students you can recruit and train. So suddenly, what you expect because of those resources is your trajectory goes up, right? Now you come up for promotion to associate professor with tenure. And this is where everybody says, okay, tenure is, you can lie back on this bed of roses and you're good. Um, but he said, and you got to think, okay, when you get tenure, what's the resource you get? You don't get more money for your lab. You don't get more access to lab space. Tenure now is the freedom to take risks that you could never take before.
Yeah.
You can think, so before you were always thinking on a year-to-year
Freedom to get
basis,
weird.
got to get this done, got to get this published paper out. Now I can think much more in the long term. So when, after a couple of years, you want to get promotion to professor, the question is, how did you use that resource of tenure to take a risk that you never took before?
Yeah.
That's the basis for any kind of promotion beyond. And that's, I totally agree with that. Right.
Yeah.
And that's the first question I would ask people. And the one thing we got to do is just tell people, hey, you can take a risk now. Stick your neck out. It's way more fun.
Well, I think it is, and it's coming back to, if you think about our brains, they're kind of a black box in our head, and it's this weird sense making thing inside of us that's driving literally my hand. Like, there's a bunch of other things that make that work, but you know, the decision to do this that came from somewhere. If we're not using these things in the most adventurous, incredible way possible, what a freaking boring life. And
What a
it's like,
waste.
I mean, we've got so many people who are lifelessly in these institutions that are not running with joy towards an exotic, wild, curious future, which every professor, every student should be living in that flow state. And anybody who's involved in your lab should be on this mad dash to figure out, how can I translate what's happening in bee brains to create more value and more impact and more beauty to the human existence, period. Like, what
Yeah.
do I do? How do I commercialize the hell out of that? And how do I hand it off to entrepreneurs and founders and my breakthroughs? And most often, let's be frank, universities and national labs are piss poor at commercialization. And there's a whole reason why. But in my
We don't have
opinion,
incentives to commercialize.
totally. And the tightening of the loop will get tighter, I think, in this next window of society. And the relationship, if it's done right, should be exponentially beneficial to the market, to founders and entrepreneurs, and to the researchers and to the universities to create more abundance and more magic than we've ever seen. Because
But one reason that people don't want to take those risks is most cool, edgy, risky projects fail.
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
And if all of your experiments succeed, then I'm going to tell you you're not asking interesting enough questions.
you're not pushing the limits. If you're a scientist, if you're a founder, you're
That's
just
it's one of the
you're a business
disincentives
owner.
to taking risks,
Yeah,
because you're
yeah,
going to get punished for failure. Whereas I think you should get lauded for failure,
I agree.
because you're taking risks. And um, I just had an example. I was thinking about this, and now talking about something else.
Escaped your
Uh,
brain.
no, yeah, that's how my brain works.
Yeah,
Um, uh, where we need to incentivize risk. DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. They invented the internet,
yeah.
despite of what Al Gore said, 50 years ago. Um, I've gotten funding from DARPA, and DARPA funding is at the same time exciting and scary. Not that we're building weapons, and they tell us explicitly, you're not building weapons. We just want potential to do stuff, right? Figure out how the brain works, because we want to build that into something. And they want really out there projects. In other words, if you just propose something that's an incremental advance over what you're doing, they'll just, ho hum, no, we're not interested. And they will outright tell you, we expect 98 out of 100 of our funded projects to not work. But those 2 that work are really amazing. So maybe in a few minutes, once we get this prep up and running, I can walk my
Is
computer.
that one of the DARPA projects?
That started as a DARPA project 25 years ago, because we couldn't get NSF or NIH to let it pass their front door, Matt.
Huh. Interesting.
DARPA funded it, and now it's just a regular routine thing that we train high school students to do.
Oh, that's cool. Well, coming back to like commercialization and brains and brain health, and I'm excited to see it and show people the brain that you're working on, the bees and the brains. But when you think about brain health and behavior, because a core thing is you're a behavioral, researcher. You research how the brain works and how it drives behavior and choice, and how that then applies to our health and machines and society and culture and AI, potentially all these different areas. When you look at the world right now, and the amount of noise and content that's coming at us. You mentioned something about being able to ignore things, and you mentioned even potentially like a gene or like ways to modify ignoring things. Besides Adderall, like what's the best way to focus for people? Because like the jokes about founders taking Adderall would be like all hyper and focused, but what what have you learned that translates to that? Because the world is a noisy place and it's hard to focus sometimes.
Um, and I can say from my own personal standpoint.
Yeah,
Um,
or what you've learned from bees.
well, just what I've learned from myself is I like to write. I really like to write, and I can get off on all sorts of tangents while I'm sitting there trying to get the first sentence down on the paper. Um, and one of the things I found is I just have to start writing, sometimes even just things that kind of nonsensical. And then suddenly, about 3 paragraphs in, I'll get the first sentence of what I want to write. So it's a process. And at that point, instead of, I find when I'm thinking about so many different things, when I hit that point, then it's like my focus just boom.
Sucks in.
Yeah. And I can't stop writing at that point. I have to stop at some point.
Do you have a
But
process you use for writing? I like this because in a world where a lot of people are using AI and prompts now to write, and I use it to clean up documents, to do certain things. However, there's still something I've been reading. Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman.
oh yeah, we
And
talked about that a week or two ago.
yep, and the ability to get your ideas clear on paper is really important, and I think especially now when speaking into an AI and then this other brain goes and does the work is really important, like for own long term brain health. Do you have patterns that you write in? And then I want to talk about brains a bit more.
So I when I was a young graduate student, 24 or 25 years old, my I was at a meeting in Germany with my PhD mentor, and he said, "Hey, I'm going to go have lunch with a friend. Why don't you come along?" I thought, "Yeah, sure, why not?" Well, his friend was like actually like one of the most famous biologists in our field at the time. His name was E.O. Wilson, and maybe a lot of people haven't heard from him, but he's really famous, and he writes book after book after book. And I'm sitting there, and I'm this intimidated young graduate student thinking, I got to say something smart to this guy. So suddenly, in the middle of conversation, I blurted out, "How do you write so much?" And he thought for a second, and he looked at me and he said, "Well, I get up in the morning, I make my tea, I sit down, I write 500 words, I stop. That's usually about 7 or 7:30 in the morning, and then I got the rest of the day to myself." And it's true. So I have this thing where I use the word count in Word all the time, and I think, okay, I'm starting at 2,000 words, and when I hit 26, 2,700, I'm done. Sometimes I hit 3,500, but then the likelihood is I'm going to come in tomorrow and throw about 600 of them out because I don't like them anymore, right? So that's my process for getting writing. But I'm actually taking part, and I just had a meeting this morning to plan for a discussion group with a bunch of students next week about when should you and when should you not use AI to help you in your writing. And one of the points I'm going to make is writing as a process for me is hard. It is really hard. That's why a lot of people want to use AI to do it. But when I engage with that difficulty and force myself to think through it, I understand my own work so much better.
Yeah.
And I've had so many aha moments in the middle of a manuscript that led to a whole series of experiments that I wasn't thinking about when I was starting to write that manuscript. And it was just simply the difficulty of forcing me to engage with what I've done. How do I represent it? How do I show it to people? And the process of doing that so many times leads to my own aha moment that I realized something I hadn't realized before. If you
And
get
then when
AI
you
to write your papers, you're gonna have a much more superficial relationship with your own work,
yeah,
and that's
yeah,
my
and
point
your
I
own
want to make.
knowledge, not just your own work, but like your
Well, yeah,
actual
exactly.
mastery of carrying it into a mission that matters. Because I think the goal of work should be that you're becoming fluent in an area of expertise that becomes this incredible value add to society. And the more you have mastery over your kind of fluid knowledge and the different pieces you're putting together, the more you create this sculpture or a piece of art that actually is worth something to the world, that you can show up with consistently and try and deliver it over and over. And if you're not writing it out and you're just task, you never can share it to plug into this greater hive mind back to bees. Because if you think about libraries and writing and books and now the internet and now quite literally Google and AI and web crawlers and search and agents, all these tools are operating as one giant collective hive mind that are sucking up knowledge bits, and that's good and bad. And damn it, we better be putting in good stuff into there, or else we're going to be creating, problems for you and I and the collective whole. And when you think about brain health, you know, you push me away from the alien thing, but I'm going to come back to it because there's always the comments of like the size of aliens' heads when people talk about like how big they are, and do we
Don't
need the
get me
body?
started on that. That's the
Well,
problem for the alien.
right. But do we need the exactly? Do we need the body or the brain? And bodies get smaller and the heads get bigger. And so my question was, what's happening to our brains right now, like the human brain? From Brian's perspective, have you tracked any historical trends around the human brain that are interesting? Are you, because you're working on bee brains and trying to translate it to human impact, what are you watching?
Well, let's start off with how the brain develops.
Okay.
I said a human brain. These are some statistics I'll talk about and show in a few weeks. Something like 85 billion neurons in our brain, and the neurons are the unit of information. Close to it, right? How many stars are in the galaxy? 200 billion. I mean, we're approaching galaxy-sized numbers. All
In
right.
our own.
Now, each of those neurons makes 10,000 connections. So, I mean, we're talking how many connections are in a human brain? We're talking, I mean, I think we're getting into something like the quadrillions, right? Those connections are extraordinarily plastic. So they form, they retract based on learning. Um, so when a human baby is born and you estimate the number of connections in a baby's brain, they have more connections in their brains than we have in ours. So when you think they're making quadrillions of connections, how do you make them so specific so that you can get anything done? Well,
Yeah.
one way is you grow out many connections, and then the ones that aren't working, you prune them back. So what you're left with are the connections that worked. And watch a baby learn how to walk. You're
Hmm.
watching its brain change as it's behaving, right? Its brain is taking
Okay.
shape. Those connections, those synaptic connections, are growing out and retracting based on the baby falling over. Whoops, I better not do that anymore, right?
Huh.
So if you look at the development of connections in a human brain, it starts with a lot in the first year and hits upon the final number approximately when somebody's 18 or 20 years old. So when
Really?
someone says those early teenage years are extraordinarily important for development of the brain, I think we have to think seriously, what are these games? What are this constant TikTok engagement? What's that doing for shaping that, forming that developing brain?
Yeah.
And that's one thing we're seeing right now that we have to worry about. And I say, let's just say be concerned with, right?
Sure. Sure.
Because
Observing with
because what
caution.
those brains may be doing is developing, not evolving, but developing better ways to interact with that hive brain that you're talking about, right? And that's actually kind of an interesting proposition that maybe it's not entirely. I don't like kids to be on TikTok all the time, especially when I'm lecturing. But um, when you think about it, maybe there's some good that comes out of it because the brains are really plastic. It's like clay, and it's getting molded so
Sure.
that those brains are going to be better interacting with that hive mind as that hive mind takes shapes and develop and becomes much more powerful.
Which is a whole.
What I said was just totally off the cuff and speculative.
Yeah, but I hear you, and it's not. So it's interesting because it plays into the whole comment. I think once, and it's kind of in lore now. I think it was Musk and Sergey Brin or something like that. It was like founder of Google, I think for sure one of them there was. And they got in this debate about are you speciest or not? Basically, like, are you?
Hold on, I was just getting the brain. The brain's almost ready, so we'll be in. We'll be in a minute. Okay.
Sounds good.
Cool.
Sean.
Yeah, but like the idea of is what is the use of our brain? Are we protecting it just to make it a human only thing, or are we trying to plug it into the bigger computer? And do we evolve into this digital transcendence where it's like man and machine merge, and our brains are now plugged into that? And they got into this whole weird dialogue, rabbit holes you can go down. But when you think about, before we go look at the project, you commented on like maybe our brains are evolving for better or for worse. Are we watching our brains health wise? Like, have you seen trends? I remember talking to you, and I think you said something about like our brains are getting tinier, but that might not be a bad thing.
Yeah. So
like, I don't want to be
look at the evolution of human brains. You normally think, well, bigger brains are better, and yes, we have way bigger brains than we need to control our bodies, and that's why we're so smart, right?
Yeah.
If you look at over the last 20,000 years or 10,000 years, and you look at our ancestors, and you look at the size of the brain estimated from the cranium of a skull, our brains are actually getting smaller. In fact, we've lost something over the last 10,000 years, something the equivalent of between a golf ball and a tennis ball sized chunk of our brain. Why is that? Brains are expensive. Brains are... Pardon?
Up to a tennis ball?
Something like between a golf ball and a tennis ball.
In what time period?
About 10,000 years.
Okay.
So now think, brains are metabolically the most expensive organ in our body relative to a heart, a lung, a kidney. A brain is about 5% of our body weight, but it consumes about 20% of our total calories. So that's the thing where it's expensive, it's costly, you better use it if you're going to have it. But when you think about what's been happening over the last 10,000 years, especially over the last 1,000 years, is technology, right? The printing press. So suddenly you didn't have to keep in your head all the time what was there. You could go read it in a book. And then you have newspapers, radio, television. And now we store so much externally. You don't really have to know everything anymore. You just have to know where to find it. So that's at least one reason, speculatively, that our brains could be becoming a little bit smaller, is we don't need all that brain to do all this stuff. I mean, there are other hypotheses too, like where we live in a civilized society, and everybody thinks we're not so civil these days. But if you go back 200 years, you probably would see what uncivil looks like.
It's kind of awesome, actually, how we are. Do bees? So, like on nutrition, because you mentioned like the calories that take to run our brain, and we went through this whole like, sugar-free, fat-free, aspartame era of like everything should be made of a chemical that gets rid of fats, and now we're in this mode where we're like, wait a second, our brains need fat. Like that's actually how brains run. They run on good fats.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to load up on good fats at the beginning of the day. And there's all sorts of experimentation with intermittent fasting protocols to like activate your brain and like not drive blood to your stomach for digestion too early, so it slows down your brain. Do bees have similar things to that, to where it's like bees don't need fat, I'm gonna assume, because they're not like gorging on a carcass, but like what do they use to fuel? I'm assuming
they use sugars.
Sugar?
We use glucose. They use a sugar called trehalose, is one of them. And I did an accidental experiment years ago that was actually pretty cool. And we train bees. You give them a little odor, and then you take a droplet of sugar water, which they like, and you touch their antennae, so let them taste it. They stick out their mouth parts, and then you let them drink it, consume it. All right.
Okay.
So we thought, well, what happens if we just don't let them feed on it? We just touch their antennae, so they get the sensory input. There's sugar there. And it turns out over the short term, a few hours, it doesn't make a difference. The bees learn just as well. It doesn't matter if you feed them, okay? Now, test them 24 hours later, and the bees that weren't allowed to feed forgot. the bees that were allowed to feed remembered. And one of the reasons is the sugar gets into their bloodstream, hits their brain, and then their brain gets jazzed up, and you engage much more readily the circuits that involve formation of memory. So yeah, bees need the sugar. And as far as humans go, I mean, as humans today, we have a lot of body fat, right? I usually joke that my body actually looks like a lean Aboriginal body. I just keep it encased in a layer of protective fat. But if you take someone who has 5% body fat, they probably don't want to have aspartame. They need the carbohydrates, they need the fat. We don't. The reason we take aspartame is we're trying to get rid of it. We have too much of it, and it's unhealthy.
Yeah.
But down to a certain point, you'd much rather have glucose than aspartame.
I think so. Like coming into the brain piece, to like take a pause on that, and back to bees and primal nature. A lot of our screw up though is that we're not functioning in a primal state as people, and so instead we're being tricked into eating garbage that isn't good for us and tricks our brains chemically to keep going. And
Mhm.
so we shove our faces full of stuff that makes us fat and stupid, literally.
Easy carbs.
Yeah,
We don't have to.
like
Yeah, our body
literally.
doesn't have to work to
And
digest them.
instead of functioning as like an actual primal, human being to have optimal output and do our task in this world, we're like, oh, I want to please myself because I hate my job, I hate my life, and I'm just going to go eat something that makes me happy for a second. And instead, we should be, treating our brains with the dignity and respect and our minds and our bodies it deserves to actually fuel ourselves appropriately. So we can. It's not about being skinny; it's about being powerful. It's not about being rich; it's about being powerful, and powerful not in a way of manipulation, but standing in your power to do alchemy with the universe to create value and beauty. And it's like I think about a lot of the art of education and research should be about, are we creating human flourishing or not? I think it's a deep question for me and everything we do, especially when we're spending research dollars. You want to show the brain? Because I know he's ready, right? Is he
Oh
over
yeah,
there?
yeah.
Yeah, sure. Let's go look at a bee brain. Like
So
wander us
you're
over.
going to see Sean Mahoney, who's a PhD student in my lab.
Yeah,
Who
and then I've
does
got
these
a
recordings.
question
Sorry,
on.
it might make you dizzy a little bit as I walk through my lab with my computer.
That's okay. And we're going to go meet Sean. How long is the walk over there?
I'm there.
Oh, yeah.
You ready? So this is Sean.
What's up, Sean?
And Sean's doing his thesis, doing some of these recordings from bee brains that we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And do you have a bee in there?
I do. Let's the door there should be a door set somewhere around there, so we're not having to prop this thing open. There we go. That's good.
So there, you can hardly see a bee.
Here, point it down a little bit. I can see like the eye part. Okay, I can see the light now better. Yeah.
That's the bee right there where the light is.
Okay.
And it's got electrodes in its head, and that's the recording, and those are action potentials from several different neurons in the bee's brain right now as it's sitting there thinking.
Are you guys doing anything to it?
Not right now. No, this is just background activity. Can you, hey Sean?
Yeah.
Can you turn an odor on or something?
Yeah. Give me 2 seconds. I have to turn on the airflow.
So you can see how, this whole apparatus here is all digital. It used to be huge when it was all analog many years ago, and now it's all fully digital and it's become tiny. And we put the bee in this.
It's hard to see the bee because you can only see the light when you point at it. But are those little like injectors? I don't know if how close you can get. Yeah, we can only see the light. I can't
see the green thing above the bee.
Yeah, and then it's like a bright
That's
light.
the electrode, and that comes down to a tiny, tiny little point.
Okay.
And that's the thing that's inserted into this bee's brain right now.
Is he like pinned down? Like is he?
Yeah,
like,
we have to hold them. We have to hold them steady. We can't have them moving very much while we're doing this recording.
How do you pin him down? Do you have like little Velcro straps?
Duct tape.
Oh, funny.
It's a universal tape that's good for everything, including restraining bees.
That's
So Sean's
crazy.
getting ready to stimulate, and when he stimulates, hopefully, then you'll see suddenly you'll hear a lot of clicking, and there'll be a lot of noise.
Yeah, so there's a there's a thing going, like a machine going off right now that's supposed to be delivering air toward the bee. So let's see if we can get.
Oh, it sends them a little smell. There was a question from Chris, and it was do you ever do research on comparison between types of people's brains, like the normal human versus a human with a disability, and how they process differently? How does that play into bees? Like, do you have bees with disabilities, and do you have different types of bee brains?
Well, bees aren't tolerant of disabilities, really. If a bee's not functioning normally, the colony will kill it. But not to say this is a ability disability, but what I was talking
Sure.
about earlier, bees have different abilities, and we've been able to show using these same recordings that you're seeing right now how those different abilities are engaged or encoded in the brain. Now, I don't work on humans, but we have a huge center here for studying neurodegenerative diseases.
Yeah.
It's extremely well funded, and they have a lot of researchers interested in Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and any kind of neurodegenerative disorder, frontal temporal lobe dementia. And so we have a lot of people here doing that. I don't do it myself in particular, but I do interact with these people because I used to run the graduate program in neuroscience, and they're a big part of that.
Yeah, you try to understand behavior in kind of hive mind systems and inputs for bees and other insects, and
Yeah,
then
I mean,
apply.
that's the gold standard in understanding the human brain is to understand what's happening when something goes wrong.
Yeah.
You get neurodegeneration. Uh, are you ready?
Oh yeah, we're about ready
Oh,
here.
hold
Let
on.
me.
So let me get the right picture here.
Yep.
So we'll see what happens when.
So just going to start this now. And what this is going to do is there will be 8 puffs of odor, and it will slowly ramp up the airspeed with each puff. And we should start seeing some responses around, like, I don't know, 4 or 5.
Is the green the puff?
Yes, so the green is the puff here, and then these dots are the action potentials. And so
What are
the
you
more
blowing
of
at?
these. Sorry?
What are you blowing? What smell?
It's literally just unscented air, actually. So we don't have an odor attached at the moment.
We were interested in the mechanosensory input of the air.
Okay.
So the touch, the feel of the wind.
Yeah.
So we're not getting very much of a response yet, and that happens sometimes.
Yeah.
We're starting to see a little bit more right here. We'll see if that.
When you get a little, when you start getting responses, you start to hear a lot of clicking, which is just the audible signal to us that we're seeing action potentials.
That there's something
So
there.
actually, that's probably good, Sean.
Okay.
Thank you.
John?
So yeah, I mean, that's what we do. And I mean, we talked about Parkinson's disease. I actually had some funding from the Parkinson Center some years ago because
Did you research on bees?
yeah, well,
A bit more.
the one of the early hallmarks of Parkinson's disease and the holy grail right now is early diagnosis.
Okay.
Because by the time someone's really clearly coming down with the disease, you're much more limited in what you can do for them if you're a doctor, an MD. But if you can pick out 10 years in advance likely signs of developing Parkinsonism or something, you can do a lot more for somebody. And it turns out one of the early signs is loss of the sense of smell. So when grandpa or grandma complains they can't smell anything anymore, well, it could be normal age-related decline, but it could also be early signs of Parkinson's disease, because one of the early clinical hallmarks in the brain of Parkinson's pathology starts off in the olfactory bulb. And one of the things I was interested in was we have to understand how olfaction works in a fundamental sense, and it works pretty much the same in bees and humans. In order to understand, well, when you disrupt something, why how's it getting disrupted to produce the decline in olfactory sensitivity that we do. That was some of the work I did years ago.
Yeah, and olfaction is like the ability to smell, right? And what
Yeah.
what translated out of that? Like, was that I'm intrigued in that space of like when you finish a paper, you submit that paper, it gets published, or you submit your research to the foundation. What do they do with it?
I can't really answer that question right off the bat.
Sure.
I publish papers. Hopefully people read them, people cite them. I can get on Google Scholar and I can see, well, how many people have cited my paper. But I don't always track down who's citing my papers and why.
I'm really intrigued. There's some new AI being developed around different publication kind of research for PhDs and how you can interact with the whole body of information around topic areas in a more natural language manner that's call and response and having a dialogue in essence with it, and look for breakthroughs or pattern matches. Because I think one of the inefficiencies in the publishing space and like the paper space is, it's nice that we do them. Let's go.
Pardon? What was it?
It's nice that we do them, but like, let's go. Let's ship. Let's build something. And like back to the commercialization side, a lot of this problem, in my opinion, of commercialization and maybe some of the critique of research in universities is there is a breakdown in relationship between inventors who take research and translate it to a product, or founders who take that invention and turn it into a scaled company, or whatever it is. It's missing because a lot of these centers, they're doing the research, they have the patents out there for people to license. No one knows how to go get the licenses.
There's no connection. You and I have talked about this new NSF program that does that. And one of the things that's exciting for me is, and what this does is it takes basic research and connects it up with some startup companies that want to build a product that will commercialize and capitalize on all this public money that's been invested in basic research. And I think it's an exciting program.
I've worked in multiple national laboratories and their research centers to try and understand how they do tech transfer and helped analyze their tech transfer system. One of the most shocking things to me, like blew my mind, is the lack of relationship in the local communities.
Yeah.
You want to start with where you look, putting all of your research on the internet. That's cute. That's nice. Putting it in a database that's searchable. Okay, maybe, or a spreadsheet. Fun. We're getting somewhere. Hiring a law firm to go out and find which companies might be interested in getting licenses on it so they can defend their moats. What's more interesting to me is connecting the researchers with people who are just curious moms and dads and grandpas and grandmas who have garages where they're like making weird things. Like when we think about inventing airplanes and doing things that were incredible breakthroughs, it's a bunch of like weirdos. And the more we can create weirdo cross culture, the better off we are. We need that.
I'm gonna have a bigger answer to that statement you're making. But when you said airplanes, I really like airplanes. That was like an alternative career for me at one point, was maybe flying. But there's a journal called Gleanings in Bee Culture, and it's all about honeybee keeping and apidology and things. And it's been published since way back into the 19th century. And when I got my job at Ohio State University, I was like the fourth person in line to have this position. So I inherited all the literature collections of my predecessors, right? Including bound volumes of Gleanings in Bee Culture over like 100 years. So somebody told me, hey, and the guy who published this, his name was A.I. Root, and it was in Ohio. Someone told me that he published a picture of the Wright Flyer. And I went and I actually had the Gleanings on the shelf of that year. It was like 1900 something. And I opened it up and there's a picture of the Wright Flyer. And it was one of the first public pictures. It's in the Smithsonian Museum. That volume of Gleanings in Bee Culture, open to that page. It's in the Air and Space Museum, showing the first picture of the Wright Flyer was in Gleanings in Bee Culture. And A.I. Root, you read the article and he said, A lot of people think these guys, something like a lot of people think these guys are crazy, but you know what? They're really industrious, and I think they might be onto something.
That's hilarious.
And but that
It's
was but you said something about connecting people locally to
yeah,
researchers. And one of the things in this program from NSF that you and I have discussed that interests me is when I meet people at the Innovation Collective who are, just interested in creating things and building startups, is, well, I know universities and I know
sure.
how to connect with people at universities. And I think one thing that, as you said, is missing is there's a lot of connectivity that we could implement that would be very creative. And I think it would be really interesting and exciting to see if we can facilitate the connection of inventors to people at University of Idaho, Idaho State University, at University of Utah. That's part of our Mountain West region, right? And there are a lot of people doing things in those places where it's like low
Incredible
hanging
work.
fruit. It's like almost like low hanging fruit where you bring the people together who develop the research with the people who can actually create things.
Yeah.
And you're kind of leveraging you're taking two people who are good, who found what they're good at, research, creating things, and you're bringing them together and adding 1 + 1 and getting 3.
Well,
And
and I
that's what
also
I think is an exciting possibility in
it
the
is
near future.
well very near future, right? Because funding is starting to look like the funding flows are changing, and in that instance, I think one of the things that's going to be really clear is what are people putting out the other side, and what are the results? They're talking about results based funding for treatment of homelessness and drug addiction.
Hmm.
I like that actually. Like it puts the incentives in the right way. And so, in the same way we're smoking out bad funding in certain areas, it's like how do we have the freedom to get weird and do science and do research with a mandate that ship, and like let's put something at the other side that improves value with the long view of history, because we have to have the long view of history in science, but it has to have direct results as well. And I think this plays into something around like the world we've built, because the world we've built is not kind to our brains right now. Like millions of hours of information being thrown at our faces, and
Hmm.
we don't know how to operate in it. Millions of hours a day being uploaded into the internet, and it's like our brains get overwhelmed. We need better patterns that allow for a culture to consume what's really important and to translate that into breakthroughs that do add value to our lives and our cities and our communities. And I will say, you mentioned getting experts together. I think beyond experts only, it's also about how do we get curiosity and culture infused in openness into these institutions and into the homes, because it's both, it's town and gown, right? So it's the universities, it's the national labs, but it's also the cities where people don't really cross over. And I'm most interested in a billionaire founder, a bunch of pub crawlers that go out and hit the pubs and watch football games, and a mechanic and a single mom and a scientist all getting together to talk about something that they all kind of have a little bit of curiosity around,
Hmm.
and what comes out the other side of that, that's what the magic is. And that's where optimizing culture in our brains and our systems to lean into that direction is where I'm hopeful we see incentives adjust towards to building friendships around curiosities that create value, and mandating that, to be frank, for everyone, because the
So
students at university should be mandated to hang
one thing I think
outside of it and create.
you and I had this discussion years ago when we first met at an Innovation Collective event. Um, and I was just moving to Coeur d'Alene, where my wife and I have a house, and I'm in Phoenix now at our house here. Um, but one of the things that drew me to the Innovation Collective is the article in the Atlantic that James Fallows wrote,
Yeah, James is great.
where he got in his airplane and he said, all we hear about is dysfunction and chaos at high levels of government, and it's depressing. But he said, I wondered I think his thesis was, he wondered what's happening locally. So he flew around to a lot of small communities like Coeur d'Alene, like Redlands, California, and he just started to talk to people locally, and he found there's a lot of innovation, a lot of communication, and the trick is, I can meet someone who's politically the opposite of me, and I always challenge myself to find something in common that we're both interested in and see value in. And that's what you can do in a local community, right? Is let's forget about the politics for now, and let's talk about fixing the sewer system. Let's talk about helping police do their job, because we all have a common you have to find a common interest, and that's what's going to bring people together locally.
I could not agree more, and I think for most people to even transcend, you know, the fixing of things, because I think sometimes when you start talking about the fixing of things, it can become divisive in a weird
Mhm.
way. So like when you're looking for commonalities around what to fix, sometimes one person might think it's not broken or how to fix it completely different. I'm really interested in the most powerful bridging and bonding commonality is that you have dreams and goals and aspirations of what you want to make that you think would be magic for the world, and so do I. And so if we can get into that like weird, curious invention, value creation space, it's really hard to judge you for the most valuable, beautiful thing you want to create for the world. And instead, it bonds me to you because I want to see it happen too. Like I'm
Mhm.
curious. Tell me more
Mhm.
about your idea. And that's a really powerful bridging tactic to build community that transcends political, racial, socioeconomic, any barrier. And it's a currency that not only bonds us, but if we actually accomplish the goal, it creates real economic and social currency. And that's
Yeah,
the cool part is like we can, make up things out of our brains and build friendships that build things that build value. That's
right.
that's the magic of using our brains in a really powerful way. Do you have any, in kind of the signing off and learning about the primal nature of bees, you know, do you have any parting comments that you think are important? And it could be more about, how we manage our brains as humans or what you love about bees, but leaning into that kind of understanding the brain primal space. Any final thoughts or comments there?
Um, I think science, and this is when I retire. You and I've talked about. I've been wanting to write a series of articles about science and the way science works, because I think it's very misunderstood. When a scientist says something, he's not saying this is true. He's saying, to the best of our knowledge, this is the closest approximation to the truth that we get, and it means they could still be wrong. So then, when something comes out to contradict that scientist, um, everybody thinks, well, science is bad. And what I see is a very healthy process that got us from the Wright Flyer to landing on the moon in 60 years,
Sure.
right? That went from that overnight cured. I mean, this is an example I like to give. Um, when I used to teach introductory biology, I would say, you meet someone who comes down with, they get infected with something. It takes several years for it to develop, and then they start to waste away slowly and have all sorts of other kinds of medical issues. And I said, what am I talking about? And most of them would say HIV, and I'd say, no, tuberculosis. And how many of you know somebody who died of tuberculosis? Nobody raises their hand. And why is that? It's because of the accidental almost discovery of antibiotics,
Yeah.
right? And that totally changed
Changed
society.
everything.
That's
And I think
science.
I think we need to operate in a way that we're looking for in the spirit of Bob Ross. We need to operate in the manner that we're looking for happy little accidents
Yeah,
applied to big, hairy, audacious problems of our society and time. We need to realign how people aspire to solve things in the world and then open up our lifestyles so that we bump into happy little accidents by putting ourselves in places where those little accidents can happen versus
yeah.
just sucking our freaking
Well,
eyeballs into another screen
I mean, the
and have our life
archetypical the archetypical representation of a scientist is they discover something and say, "Eureka! I found it."
dream.
But in
Yeah.
reality, it's more like, "Hey, wait a minute, that looks weird."
It's not as sexy, Brian. It's
I know, but it's true. It's true.
hey, what was that? Huh?
And that's how streptomycin, which cured tuberculosis. tuberculosis overnight went from practically a death sentence to being curable, because somebody who studied a fungal infection in chickens realized that, hey, wait a minute, there's something I'm doing here. No, it was studying another kind of infection in chickens, but he couldn't get the bacteria to grow in these plates that had fungus in them. The fungus were producing streptomycin. It was almost like an accidental discovery of something that profoundly changed the nature of this disease in humans.
And we, you know, that's where keep digging in the bee brains, my friend, and unlock the superpowers of our brains in a better world. I appreciate the time today.
Well, it's been fun. I like to have these conversations.
Me too. Me too. And if people want to reach out to you for questions around kind of behavioral research, how you work with the national labs, how you work with DARPA or the NSF or things like that,
Brian H. Smith at asu.edu.
There we go. Brian H. Smith.
Don't be like my students. Talk to me.
That'd be awesome.
And I'll give the talk in the Innovation Collective that goes in a little bit more detail on some of this stuff in a few weeks.
Perfect. I really appreciate it. And I'll make sure to invite more folks out to that one too. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Nick. Bye-bye.
And then we will sit here and it will finish uploading. That was awesome. Thank you, Brian.
So we're not live anymore?
We're not live anymore.
Okay. Yeah, I hope that was okay. It was a lot. I had fun.
Yeah, me too. It went all over in a good way. Like my whole thing on doing this podcast is I want to talk about people's areas of interest and then also how it all applies to a much bigger picture of business, economics, current things happening, introduce people to scientists, people like you, and keep having fun talking about it. And it was good. It's really good.